The most successful mafia boss in American history was never arrested, never publicly exposed, and never defeated. While others built their reputations through violence and spectacle, Carlo Gambino built his through absence. He did not conquer New York with gunfire or speeches. He ruled it by never being where trouble could find him. From the beginning, Gambino understood what many criminals never learned. Power attracts attention, and attention shortens lives. In the early decades of American organized crime, men chased recognition as if it were protection. They confused fear with control and visibility with authority. Gambino watched them rise quickly and disappear just as fast. He did not compete with them. He waited for them to remove themselves. Born in 1902 in Palermo, Sicily, Gambino grew up in a culture where survival depended on discretion. Authority was informal, often invisible, and rarely announced. Men who spoke too much or acted too quickly did not last. Violence existed, but it was controlled and purposeful, never impulsive. These lessons shaped Gambino long before he became a criminal in America. By the time he illegally entered the United States in 1921, he already understood that restraint was not weakness. It was strategy. New York City in the 1920s was chaotic. Prohibition transformed crime into an industry, flooding neighborhoods with money, guns, and ambition. Rival gangs fought openly, turning streets into battlegrounds and drawing the attention of police and politicians. Many young criminals believed this chaos was opportunity. Gambino saw it as a filter. The louder men became, the faster they exposed themselves. He aligned himself with Sicilian networks that valued structure over showmanship. He avoided public violence, kept his movements limited, and never attempted to force his way into leadership. Instead, he made himself useful, reliable, and forgettable. This approach did not make him famous, but it kept him alive. The Castellammare War of the early 1930s confirmed everything Gambino believed. Two mafia factions fought openly for control of New York, killing relentlessly and attracting unprecedented law enforcement attention. While bosses ordered murders daily, Gambino stayed on the margins, aligning himself with Lucky Luciano, who recognized that the war itself was the real threat. When Luciano emerged victorious and dismantled the old system, Gambino emerged with him, alive, trusted, and positioned for the future. The reorganization of the American Mafia replaced chaos with structure. The commission was created to regulate disputes and prevent destructive wars. For many, it was a compromise. For Gambino, it was the perfect environment. Power no longer required intimidation alone. It required discipline, patience, and cooperation. These were qualities Gambino already possessed. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, his rise was quiet. He avoided leadership roles that brought attention and focused instead on stability. He built relationships across families, handled disputes discreetly, and ensured money flowed without disruption. Law enforcement struggled to define him. Arrests were rare. Informants mentioned him only vaguely. In a criminal world built on reputation, his lack of one became his shield. As the Gambino crime family evolved, Gambino moved steadily closer to its center. Vincent Mangano ruled cautiously, but his successor, Albert Anastasia, ruled through fear. Anastasia's reputation for violence made him powerful but reckless. Gambino understood that this kind of leadership invited scrutiny that endangered everyone beneath it. He did not challenge Anastasia openly. He did not need to. By the 1950s, pressure on organized crime intensified. Senate hearings exposed mafia operations to the public. High-profile figures became liabilities. Gambino adjusted quietly, strengthening alliances and distancing himself further from visible activity. When Anastasia's enemies grew numerous and his protection weakened, Gambino did nothing to stop the inevitable. Anastasia's murder in 1957 shocked the public but resolved a long-standing internal problem. Gambino stepped into leadership without announcement or display. There was no public shift, no declaration of power. Business continued uninterrupted. That continuity was the message. As boss, Gambino refined his philosophy. Violence was restricted not out of morality but necessity. Murders attracted investigations. Investigations disrupted revenue. Revenue was the objective. He focused on industries that produced steady income and required influence rather than force: construction, trucking, waterfront labor, and garments. These rackets rewarded patience and negotiation, not gunfire. Gambino also understood law enforcement psychology. Investigators chased noise. They pursued flashy bosses, visible wealth, and public reputations. Gambino offered none of it. He lived modestly, avoided luxury displays, limited meetings, and delegated extensively. Orders were indirect. Responsibility was layered. Distance became protection. By the early 1960s, Carlo Gambino had become the most influential mafia boss in America, yet remained largely unknown to the public. He had no nickname, no celebrity, no mythology. His authority existed only where it mattered, inside the system he controlled. While other bosses were imprisoned, killed, or publicly humiliated, Gambino remained untouched. He aged quietly, refining an organization designed to survive pressure without drawing attention. His power was not dramatic, but it was durable. And durability, Gambino knew, was the rarest form of success. By the mid-1960s, Carlo Gambino had solidified his control over the Gambino crime family and had become a central figure within the Mafia Commission. He was no longer just a boss of one family. He had become a stabilizing force for the entire New York Mafia. Disputes between families, which once might have erupted into open warfare, were now often resolved quietly with his input. Gambino did not need to assert authority through fear or violence. His reputation for patience and strategic thinking gave his words weight without the need for intimidation. Gambino's approach to leadership was consistent and methodical. He placed men in positions according to temperament and ability. Impulsive individuals were given tasks that could not destabilize the family if mistakes were made. Those who excelled in negotiation or managing business were rewarded with influence. This careful placement maintained stability and minimized risk. Loyalty under Gambino was not demanded. It was earned through predictability and fairness. Soldiers understood the boundaries and the consequences, yet felt secure enough to follow orders without fear of arbitrary punishment. He also maintained a strict division between the public and private facets of the family's operations. Gambino avoided flashy rackets, public gatherings, and media exposure. Unlike other bosses who allowed personal ego to dictate action, he understood that visibility was the greatest vulnerability. Law enforcement often struggled to gather evidence against him because he left almost no trace. Meetings were small and indirect, communications were layered through intermediaries, and the day-to-day operations were handled by trusted lieutenants. Gambino's personal discretion became the family's greatest protection. This careful cultivation of invisibility extended to his dealings with the business world. Gambino focused heavily on sectors that provided steady, reliable income: construction, trucking, garment production, and union influence. These industries required negotiation, influence, and strategic placement rather than brute force. Money flowed consistently, risk was contained, and exposure remained minimal. Violence was a last resort, not a tool for status. Gambino's long-term approach ensured that the family's foundation was strong enough to survive scrutiny that might have destroyed more reckless organizations. Gambino's discipline was tested repeatedly during the 1960s. Law enforcement began using new investigative techniques, including wiretaps and undercover operations. Congress held Senate hearings exposing organized crime, drawing public attention to mafia activity. Many bosses responded with aggression, attempting to silence witnesses and assert dominance. Gambino, however, remained steady. He relied on his philosophy: limit exposure, delegate responsibility, and allow others to create their own risks. While his contemporaries drew headlines and legal consequences, Gambino remained unscathed. His influence within the Mafia Commission further amplified his control. Gambino rarely dominated discussions, but his advice was respected and often decisive. Other families learned that his guidance carried a blend of authority and impartiality. He was seen not as a partisan but as a mediator whose decisions often prevented open conflict. Gambino did not seek personal glory. His leadership was a quiet assertion of power, unremarkable on the surface, yet absolute in effect. As the 1970s approached, Gambino's attention turned toward succession planning. He understood that the greatest vulnerability of any organization lay not with external threats, but with transitions of power. Without careful planning, even the most disciplined family could collapse after a boss's death. Gambino evaluated potential successors not by popularity or street credibility, but by temperament, strategic thinking, and adherence to discipline. Two figures emerged as clear candidates: Neil Delacroce, the underboss, known for his loyalty, street influence, and adherence to traditional mafia values, and Paul Castellano, Gambino's cousin by marriage, whose business-focused approach mirrored Gambino's long-term strategy. Gambino's decision would define the family's trajectory for decades. Loyalty and tradition favored Delacroce, strategy and insulation favored Castellano. Gambino chose Castellano, a decision grounded in logic, not emotion. The choice was not publicized. Gambino maintained ambiguity, allowing Castellano to consolidate quietly while keeping potential unrest contained. Delacroce's loyalty provided a buffer against immediate dissent. Gambino's method was consistent: maintain order without spectacle. By the time of his death in 1976, the family had been prepared for leadership transition, a rare accomplishment in mafia history. Even after his passing, the family remained largely insulated from the immediate dangers that had destroyed other organizations. The systems Gambino built, discipline, delegation, and invisibility, continued to function. Yet his absence revealed a truth he had known but could never fully control: judgment cannot be inherited. Castellano, though capable, lacked Gambino's instinct for timing, reading people, and managing both visible and invisible threats. The stability he maintained began to show signs of fragility. External pressures continued to increase. Law enforcement techniques advanced, RICO laws were introduced, and surveillance technology improved. The invisible networks Gambino had perfected now required absolute discipline to remain protected. Any lapse could create vulnerabilities, and without Gambino's direct oversight, small missteps slowly accumulated. The foundation remained intact, but cracks were forming in the structure that had been maintained almost exclusively by his personal judgment. Despite these emerging challenges, Carlo Gambino's legacy was undeniable. He had transformed the Gambino family into the most stable, most profitable, and most enduring mafia organization in New York. His approach, quiet, patient, disciplined, stood in stark contrast to the flamboyance and volatility of other bosses. His life demonstrated that the most powerful form of control often comes not from violence or visibility, but from calculated restraint and invisibility. After Carlo Gambino's death in 1976, the empire he had built remained powerful but subtly vulnerable. Paul Castellano assumed leadership as planned, continuing Gambino's focus on business, labor racketeering, and low-visibility operations. Yet the delicate balance Gambino had maintained through personal oversight could not fully survive in his absence. Castellano's leadership style, more rigid and distant than Gambino, created small tensions that, over time, widened into serious fractures within the family. Castellano emphasized insulated white-collar operations, avoiding street-level enforcement whenever possible. For Gambino, this had been a calculated strategy combined with personal judgment. He knew which men to trust, which conflicts to allow, and how to enforce discipline without drawing attention. Castellano, despite his intelligence, lacked the subtle authority Gambino had wielded effortlessly. Soldiers who once operated under Gambino's quiet oversight now perceived distance as neglect. Frustration grew quietly, and ambition began to stir among those who had been contained by Gambino's presence. Neil Delacroix, the longtime underboss, remained loyal to Gambino's memory and to the family, temporarily mitigating tensions. His influence kept open rebellion at bay, but it also highlighted Castellano's detachment from the street-level hierarchy. Men who had once viewed Gambino as a stabilizing force now faced leaders whose decisions seemed imposed rather than guided. While the family continued to profit, the internal cohesion that had defined Gambino's era began to erode. Externally, law enforcement pressure intensified. Conspiracy statutes, RICO laws, and increased reliance on informants transformed organized crime into a prosecutable enterprise. Gambino had insulated his organization by creating layers of responsibility, delegating operations, and maintaining indirect communication. These strategies continued to provide protection, but only if strictly followed. Castellano's detachment, coupled with the ambitions of younger members, slowly undermined the discipline Gambino had cultivated. Risk exposure increased incrementally, almost imperceptibly, until it became significant. By the early 1980s, the Gambino family faced a challenge Gambino had always avoided: the rise of a public flamboyant figure willing to draw attention. John Gotti, a capo with street charisma and ambition, began to overshadow the reserved Castellano. Gotti's visibility, confidence, and willingness to court media attention represented everything Gambino had cautioned against. Gambino had understood that recognition was dangerous because it invites scrutiny. Gotti thrived on it. To some, he seemed untouchable. To law enforcement, he became the perfect target. The contrast between Gambino and Gotti highlighted the genius of the elder boss. Gambino's authority was invisible but absolute. Gotti's was public but precarious. Gambino had survived decades of mafia wars, federal scrutiny, and internal rivalries by avoiding attention and carefully managing both personalities and operations. Gotti, by contrast, operated in plain sight, relying on intimidation, media presence, and reputation rather than disciplined structure. Even as the family faced growing internal friction and external pressure, Gambino's legacy endured. The systems he created, layered responsibility, low-profile operations, strict internal discipline, delayed the collapse of his empire and preserved profits through turbulent times. While his successors struggled with visibility, ego, and the temptation of rapid expansion, the framework Gambino had built provided stability longer than many observers expected. In retrospect, Carlo Gambino's life and methods remain a lesson in disciplined power. He did not dominate through spectacle. He did not rely on public fear or recognition. He did not court headlines. He exercised control quietly, methodically, and strategically, ensuring survival, profit, and influence without drawing attention. No flash, no prison, only calculated authority exercised with patience and foresight. The fall of Castellano and the rise of Gotti decades later only underscored the genius of Gambino's philosophy. Power, Gambino had demonstrated, was not about visibility, it was about sustainability. The most effective boss was the one whose decisions shaped outcomes long after he was gone, often without the world ever realizing his influence. Carlo Gambino had achieved that rare feat, leaving behind a legacy that few in organized crime have ever matched.